means my job here is almost done. Never take a sleeping pill and a laxative at the same time. Now, why that's interesting, I guess, is it talks, to many things. Both of these things, sleeping pills and laxatives, I think play an important role in the world. They're both, I guess, to a great extent, assistance devices. Depending on how stressed out you are, depends on how much sleeping pills you need, and I guess depending on how much cheese you eat depends on how much laxatives. But nonetheless, taken together, they create this notion of unintended consequence. But this kind of moves us into the real theme for the day, and this idea is this notion of never removing a safety barrier that has a dent in it. Now, actually, what's interesting about this is there's a tremendous amount of data included in this slide, and I think the data that's most interesting is that this barrier is working. It's functioning pretty well. And we live in a world where that data exists for us everywhere, and that's an important part of sort of what we capture. We also live in a world where, quite honestly, I could imagine my boss coming down the hallway and saying, fix that, remove that, it looks terrible. And that's a part of where we want to talk. But today's real effort is around this idea. My goodness, that slide's red. And this is around the notion of the fastest way to improve safety in an organization. Now, I'm not a big believer in this notion of a silver bullet by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it's important to understand that by changing the way our organizations respond to failure, we have the opportunity then to change our organizations, and we certainly can change our safety. Now, to get into this, let's have a little discussion around this notion of human error. I talk about error a lot, and if you were in the San Antonio meeting, you saw a presentation almost entirely covering this notion of the fact that people are fallible, and your best people make lots and lots of mistakes. Now, why that's important is because error is an unintentional deviation from an expected behavior. It's somebody doing something they didn't intend to do and having some kind of negative outcome, an event or worst-case scenario, perhaps even an accident. Now, this is error, and what scares me and what we've really learned a lot here at Los Alamos, the facility where I do this work, is that our systems are really set up to treat error as if error was intentional, as if workers were intentionally screwing up. That's a phrase I'm going to use a lot in the next 75 minutes, and that screwing up was something that workers had control over. In fact, what we did is we would go out and look at an event, we'd find the place where the worker made the error, and then we'd sort of punish the worker for the error. Now, punishment, if you could see me, I made little air quotes when I said that word, because punishment means lots of things to workers. Generally speaking, I think of punishment as kind of the old name, blame, shame, and retrain. In fact, if you asked me to define punishment at my facility, I would tell you that punishment is probably anything that pulls our workers away from work. Now, what's odd about this notion of punishing workers for doing something they didn't intentionally do is our belief is they'll come back the next day and not do something they didn't mean to do in the first place again. Now, that's where we sort of borderline a little, respectfully speaking, on crazy. And so the discussion around error is valuable for two reasons. One is I think we have to reintroduce error into the lexicon, and it's really drifted kind of away. Now, I should take a moment and tell you that I grew up in western Kansas, and so when I say the word error, you probably hear the word A-I-R, but I'm actually saying the word E-R-R-O-R. I think it's a function of my accent. I don't want to brag, but I grew up in a town called Hugoton, Kansas. I don't know if any of you know about that place, but it's a town of about 2,000 people, and my high school graduating class had 32 people in it, and again, not to brag, but you should know I was in the top 10, so that's kind of the caliber of person you're working with today. Now, this notion that error is a part of the fabric of the workplace is really valuable. In fact, one of the things we know is that the average worker doing work in context makes about 5 errors per hour. So let's say you've got, 100 employees, and you're on this conference call for an hour and a half or so. So you're going to have, about 750 errors happen in the time it takes us to have this phone call. Now, not all those errors are high consequence. In fact, most of those errors are probably really low consequence. I grabbed a pen instead of a pencil, or I got up on top of the ladder and didn't bring the right tool, or I've got a Phillips screwdriver and needed a flathead. I mean, you understand these errors because, quite honestly, you're probably masterful at making these errors. But the reason we have the discussion around error is so that we can make a room to have a discussion around this notion of cause. Now, the other speakers in this seminar have talked to you about this, and this is a pretty controversial idea. We don't have a lot of time, and sometimes it's difficult to have this conversation without being in the room. But what I'm going to tell you is that we live in a world that believes every event has a cause. And my problem with that, first of all, I disagree with that, and my problem with that is in the word cause. Because I don't think our workers cause failure. What I think our workers do actually is trigger failure. Now, we could have a big discussion, and I hope you guys don't hesitate to pop some questions in, because I'm more than willing to take questions during the presentation and after the presentation. But trigger and cause are very different. Cause assumes some kind of intentional, almost control set that the worker had control. And we tend to dumb events down, and I mean that respectfully, to sort of a two-way view. The worker has a choice to do the work right or do the work wrong. When in reality, this discussion today is going to say that two-way view is probably never there. It only becomes apparent after the event happened. Before the event took place, there were literally unlimited options, infinities worth of options that a worker could have taken. Most of those decisions equate into safe work and completion of mission, but some of those decisions equate into events. And that's kind of where we want to go. So the argument I'd make early on this, and it's one I'm going to encourage you to sort of think about and look into and research, is this notion that when we go out and search for cause, we will find cause, because cause is very apparent in retrospect. It absolutely shows up in retrospect. The problem is that I don't think we should go out and search for cause. What I think we should go out and search for is context for the whole story. And in fact, the fastest way to improve safety in your organization is to change your investigation process and your management reactions and your management response and your corrective action programs so that they don't work for a single cause, find the problem and fix it. They actually work to understand the story of the failure. They look at the context. So they're looking at multiple reasons why at that moment the event was triggered. I don't know if you guys listen to podcasts. I do, and I don't know how I got into it because I'm not very technical. But I listened to a podcast recently, and the podcast is called Freakonomics, and you can get it on iTunes. It's pretty easy to get. It's free. And there's one that they put out last week called A Mouse in the Salad. Now, if you're like me, really the title alone is enough emphasis to get in there and listen to that podcast, because who doesn't want to hear a podcast about a mouse in the salad? But it was a story about the economic impact for a chain of restaurants where a lady found a dead mouse in her salad. When it got interesting to me as a safety guy is when in the middle of the podcast they talk about sort of the multiple failures that had to happen in order for a mouse to get in the salad. And they work backwards from the mouse being in the salad all the way back to the farm where the lettuce was grown. And they talk about every step along the way that had to fail in order for that mouse to eventually get there. That's a very, very interesting way, actually an amazing way, to look at this notion of failure and to move us away from classic cause and effect to a more contextual understanding of how failure happens. So let's move on from there. That's kind of the ground rules. That's the basic premise, and that was quick, but I think that'll help us sort of set the tone for the slides we want to move into. So here's a definition of safety that we've thought about a lot, and this is a challenge too. I'm going to suggest that one of our problems, and it's a big one, is that we measure safety by the absence of events, the absence of accidents. The problem with that is that puts us into a position where we've really set our standard at this notion of perfection, and we don't have workers that are able to meet a standard of perfection. So if safety is the absence of events, what happens is we either create a system where we hide events, or we create a system where the organization's definitely going to be disappointed. I would suggest, actually, that safety is really more about the presence of defenses. And the source I would use to sort of support this idea is the automotive industry. So when they design the safety programs and safety systems in cars, they assume at a fundamental level that you're going to have a wreck. In fact, they count on you having a wreck, and the safety systems are really set up to reduce consequences of that wreck. In fact, if you're following this, and I'll bet most of you are, you're seeing some pretty remarkable things happening to motor vehicles. Collision avoidance systems, blind spot indicators, backing cameras. I mean, we can make a list probably for the rest of the hour on sort of how these things happen. What's interesting is that the automotive industry decided early that it's not about preventing failure, that in fact drivers are fallible, and probably, if you ask them, they're the weakest link in the system. It's about assuming that fallibility and then creating the opportunity for workers to be successful. And I'm on an investigation right now that I probably don't have time to talk about, but it's the most remarkable investigation because it's a direct relate to this idea. It's directly related to this notion of moving the organization away from sort of an obsession with no events to an obsession with sort of understanding how events are calculated. But this is the definition that we're dealing with now. And this is probably, if you ask me, it's pretty contemporary. This is probably the best definition I know for safety. And it's this idea that your workers sort of are in the field and that safety is the ability for those workers to perform work in a varying and unpredictable work environment. Now, here's where this gets interesting. Our workplaces are constantly moving. They're constantly varying. And, in fact, this notion of predictability, although it's a really important tool for us, and don't get me wrong, I'm a big believer in hazard analysis and mitigating for hazards pre-work and all these things, and we'll talk about all these. What's interesting is this notion that ultimately there are things we can't predict because no one person is smart enough to imagine every failure. In fact, no 10 people are probably collectively smart enough to imagine any failure. Now, that kind of moves us in an interesting way to ultimately the model we're going to use for this discussion. And it starts with this blue line. And this is the notion of work as planned. Now, why this is interesting is because this is sort of the perfect job. Now, we start the job, and everything works exactly the way we thought it would work. So this is perfect training, perfect workers, perfect customer, perfect conditions, perfect weather, perfect attitude, perfect tools, perfect problem identification. Everything is absolutely perfect. This is how we understand sort of planned work. And our belief, in fact, is that if we work this long enough, this will equate into the notion of mission success. Now, why that's important is that we have to sort of set this standard that all the work we do as safety professionals is probably directly around this blue line, this belief that work's